Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. We have our next panel, which is on the economic outlook, and we have some really great economists here. We have Holly Wade, we have Leland Miller, and John Silvia. Their bios are in your pamphlet, so I will forego that, but they are all super amazing, super brilliant people. And as we learned yesterday, when you have 3 economists on a single panel, you're gonna get 10 different opinions. So let's just jump in there. So the big elephant in the room is, I'm going to ask each of them this. What is your view on a U.S. recession? Are we headed for a mild downturn or something deep and more troubling, or am I smoking something? There's no recession. So we'll start off with Holly.
Great, thank you, Dana. It's great to be here. Holly Wade, National Federation of Independent Business, and we represent around 300,000 small firms across the country. And looking at our monthly survey of small business owner sentiment and how they're operating their business, and the last one was just released on Tuesday, looking at June data, and the downturn in our headline measure, the Small Business Optimism Index, isn't so optimistic right now, although it does look like a pretzel. So while employment numbers are still very elevated, owner sentiment is plummeting quickly, and it has over the last 6 months. So the issues related around, whether this looks like a recession, some of it looks like recessionary levels, some of it looks like booming economy. They're frustrated on a number of levels. However, which way this goes, I think is just really hard to determine right now as far as the small business sector, but their outlook is certainly very dismal and frustrating for the environment that they are operating in.
John, do you have a different opinion, or do you agree?
Well, first of all, yes, we are in a recession. Again, I will paraphrase former Congressman Ryan. We indeed have an entertainment wing in the economics profession. For those of you that ever have the misfortune of watching network business news, we have people commenting on the fact that they know everything about immigration, they know healthcare, they understand perfectly foreign policy, and oh, by the way, they're going to comment on the latest economic number. So the first, I guess, piece of information we need to get through is this nonsense about employment and recession. In 1960, in the fourth quarter, we had a recession with a positive employment number. In 1970, in the first quarter, we had a recession with a positive employment number. In 1973, fourth quarter, we had a recession with a positive number. In 1974, first quarter, so 2 quarters in a row, we had a recession and still positive numbers. In 1980, in the first quarter, we had a recession and employment was positive. In 2001, and I think many of you were around during this time, first quarter, we had a recession and a positive employment number. So in 2007, some of you may have remembered that period of time. In the fourth quarter, we had a recession and a positive economic number. So the first thing is there's no link between the fact that you have a positive economic number and you have a recession. Second, for those of you that have ever been to a Major League Baseball game, you're pretty familiar with the ball in the hat kind of trick. Well, this is the problem we have with the employment number. If you think about it for just a second, you realize that we report the CPI number on a month-to-month percentage change. We report the PPI number this morning on a month-to-month percentage change. We report retail sales. We report industrial production. But we report employment as a number like 300,000. That is entirely useless. What you need to figure out is what is the month-to-month percentage change of that employment number. And why do you do that? Because you need to distinguish trend versus cycle. And if you're talking about the economy weakening into a cycle, you need to look at that particular number. Now, again, the NBER is, I think, made it clear, but as you know, many of the commentators are out there for entertainment, but the NBER has made it clear that they look at a broad brush of numbers. If you look at the 4 coincident indicators in the economy, industrial production was up 0.1% in May, and that's a declining trend. Real manufacturing and trade sales, February, March, and April were all negative. Personal income, many of you have heard this story time and time again. It's gone down. It's down year over year and down for the last 3 months. If you look at employment, in May, it was up 0.3%, in June, 0.2%. Now, many of you know I'm an econometrician. That's what I happen to do. If you do a cycle trend split, on the cycle, the employment number is minus 0.1, and the trend is down. And if any of you ever want to see that graph, I'll be glad to send it to you, or you can contact one of your friends at the gang of the Trout Ranch Gulch. We'll get it out. The problem is, if you want to look at causality or what's driving the economy, you have to take out the trend, right? Any econometrician, economist worth his salt has to know that. And when you do that, we're trending into recession. And remember, some of these numbers are only April and May numbers. They're not even June numbers, or certainly not July numbers. So in my world, we have a recession.
So Leland, why don't you give us our 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th opinions here?
Unfortunately, I'm not that different from my colleagues here. I'll take it up to 30,000 feet though. And when you look at the economy right now, I guess it's possible that you only see a mild downturn, but it's unlikely. And it's unlikely because a couple of things have to happen. On the demand side, households have to moderate their behavior. Consumers have to stop leveraging. Basically, the Fed has to be very convincing and very competent and break this mindset of buy the dip that we've had for years and years and years. So there has to be a change of mentality from the consumer. And that has to feed into the idea that the Fed is serious this time, and that they will keep going until inflation gets moderated. But even if the Fed does its job quite well, you have the supply side right now, which is a mess. And in order to get the supply side right, we have to be lucky. Now, we have to be lucky that problems in Ukraine won't metastasize further. We have to be lucky that China's COVID-0 lockdowns won't descend into another set of big city shutdowns and problems in the port and inflation exported from China's shores to US and European shores. So what I'm basically saying is, in order to get this right, the Fed has to be uber competent and convincing, and we have to be very lucky. And I think the chances of that all happening at the same time, it's probably pretty low.
Thank you. So let's go back to you, Holly. If there is a recession, if we're in one now, we're heading into one, how might this impact small firms relative to large firms? Like, I'm at the conference board and we look at big firms, but is there a real difference for small institutions?
Certainly some of the problems that they'll have to face are going to be the same. Some of the specific challenges for small firms, which actually most small firms right now do anticipate a recession. Whether they feel that they're in one now is kind of up for debate on the small business side, but they certainly feel like it's coming. They are anticipating it. They are looking at the headwinds and seeing that, this is something that they're preparing for. Since January, they have the percent of small business owners making a capital expenditure, planning to make a capital expenditure, has declined every month for the first half of the year. And then obviously business conditions over the next 6 months, that has plummeted. And so far more are saying that, the next 6 months look worse than better. But as far as large and small firms and the unique challenges of small firms, one of the big ones is their ability to access, whether it's financing or things like that. Banks aren't inclined to lend, or business owners aren't inclined to borrow to support, businesses that are in trouble. And so that tool is generally not available for small firms and never has been available for small firms, for certainly good reason. They're very dynamic. They go in and out of the economy when economic conditions shift. and in this case, shift quite dramatically. The other part that's unique to small firms is that the business owner is generally the person who has to navigate all of these challenges themselves. So in an inflation time frame where they're having to look to see if they can absorb those prices, whether they're having to absorb them initially through lower earnings, which many of them are saying that they're doing. We see that their earnings, more reporting lower earnings than higher earnings. And the reason is increased costs. So it's not declining sales right now, it's absorbing those increased costs. But having to manage and maneuver all of these different challenges that they face and the degree to which these are challenges and they're shifting quite rapidly is, I think, a very unique problem for small firms, in that there are few people within the firm making these very difficult decisions on how to move forward and how to adjust and still compete. So I think that's one of the biggest differences between small and large firms, is just that they don't have the resources available that many larger firms do in navigating these challenges in business operations. It's one or two people having to do all of it.
So whatever happens, it's definitely going to be uneven across firms as well as across individuals of different income groups. So we got that first four-letter word out of the way, recession. Here's the next four-letter word: inflation. All right, so let's start with Leland. What are we seeing? Or rather, we did get the CPI report the other day. The headline was pretty bad, but we did see some continued slowing in the core. Some prices are actually going down, especially for goods. Do you believe the Fed can successfully lower inflation back to the 2% target? If not, then what are some of the more persistent drivers of inflation? So that was a mouthful. So
yeah, and I'm going to answer it in my own particular way. I don't think that the Fed can get inflation down in the near term to 2%, but I also question how long 2% may be with us. If you think about the history of inflation targeting, it was more or less an accident of history. And late 80s, a Kiwi central banker was surprised on TV and sort of laid out the foundation for this. Other central banks adopted it. A few decades later, the Fed adopted it. And 2% became the number, not because there's any magic around 2%, but because it seemed to be the most reasonable compromise number. And it became sacrosanct because it became this incredibly important input into models for both policymakers and for corporates and for others. So we've seen 2%, and I don't think we're on the verge of leaving the 2% number anytime imminently, but I do wonder whether, if we are entering a different inflation regime, how long the 2% will be with us. There's nothing that says that the Fed will be targeting 2% or versus 3 to 4% versus a band versus anything else. So when we talk about 2%, I think it's the question of the day, but I don't think it might be the question, 10 years from now or even 5 years from now.
okay, so in all fairness, inflation and recessions are not 4 letters, they're more like 9. But either way, John, what's your thought on this very long question that I just asked?
I think the time horizon is really key with respect to what we expect for inflation. As many of you know, including Governor Waller, I look very closely at the price pressures measure published by the St. Louis Fed. I use all the public information, and they're telling me that in terms of probability for the next 12 months, we're going to be above the Fed's target of 2.5%. I also look at the bottom up in terms of rising unit labor costs. First quarter of 2022, 8.19%. In the first quarter of 2020, that was 2.74. I think the real challenge is how much political support will the Fed get in terms of achieving its inflation goal over the next 3 to 5 years. I do think it's going to take that long. In all honesty, quite frankly, Biden is not Carter. Couple of things that Carter did very well was deregulation, and another thing, he was sat back and he let Paul Volcker do what he needed to do. And so from my point of view, it's much more of an extended period of higher inflation over the next 3 to 5 years. I think there's too many changes going on. We're not going to go back to 2019. And I think there's an interesting article in Barron's in May avoiding recession may require moving the inflation goalpost. So, I think we are in recession, so we're not avoiding it. But over the longer term, the extent of this recession is going to depend upon how committed the Fed is to getting that 2%. That's going to be a challenge.
What are your thoughts, Holly?
So we have a survey coming out, a little preview on inflation and small business owners' expectations of what, increase in interest rates will look like for them in trying to, ease up or inflation. And they don't know which challenge is worse, trying to keep up with higher inflation and having to increase their prices every week or every 2 weeks, or dealing with interest rates moving up that will, ease up demand. And they're worried about how both of those interactions will impact them. And so when asking them, this is where they're very pessimistic. They're kind of pessimistic on both fronts. Nothing in the future looks good to them. But certainly getting inflation under control is hugely important for small business owners, because many of them are having to increase prices on a regular basis of 10% or more and not being able to keep up.
Well, Holly, let's stay with you for this next question. How are tariffs and deglobalization contributing to inflation? And how is the government helping or hurting on these fronts?
Certainly, we asked this question back in September about tariffs and how many small business owners were impacted by tariffs. And roughly a third said that they were negatively impacted, but the degree to which they're impacted by that versus inflation, it pales in comparison. And so I think while helpful, I'm not sure that it will have some long-term impact in easing some of these inflation pressures. It will absolutely help for many of them. But just the inflation that they're dealing with now is, far outpacing as a critical issue.
Thanks, Holly. Well, Leland, your everyday job is focused on international and the implications of things like tariffs and deglobalization. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think the conversation is completely different than it was a few years ago. So a few years ago, you would talk about tariffs. Certainly they're inflationary. Tariffs are taxes on the consumer and on someone. So certainly you have inflationary pressure coming from tariffs. Globalization, deglobalization, globalization is essentially the search for the lowest cost producer. So that's disinflationary or deflationary. And if you're reversing globalization, then that too is inflationary. So you do have these two inflationary items to talk about. But the problem is they are marbles being thrown in the ocean right now. There's a huge conversation that's being fought over internally inside the Biden administration of whether to cut China tariffs, for instance. The reason it hasn't been done, other than, well, the most optimistic reason it hasn't been done is because there's a lot of political pain that would be associated with pulling tariffs off of China. But the reality is it won't do anything. It will be absolutely negligible. Inflation right now is driven by food. It's driven by gas, lodging. Nothing about pulling tariffs off of China, whether it's a theoretical good idea or not, is going to change the inflation picture for right now. So what's remarkable is just how different the entire dynamic of tariffs are in our conversation when we talk about inflation. It's all we used to talk about 2, 3, 4 years ago. And now it's almost an afterthought in terms of driving the big time inflationary pressures.
John, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think Leland's got it right. In terms of perspective, the Peterson Institute in March of this year simply said that a reasonable tariff reduction package will reduce the CPI by 1.3%. Now, marginally, that's a positive move, but I think, as Leland was saying, the whole thrust of fiscal and monetary policy over the last year is just kind of overwhelmed that whole thing. A couple of other points I think are really key in terms of deglobalization. Exports as a share of global GDP peaked in 2009, according to the World Bank. And as an economist, looking at, well, this is going to age me, but when I read my Kindleberger, all right, when you bring products home from abroad, you end up paying higher prices because businesses naturally want to minimize their costs, and their costs are basically producing abroad and bringing it home. And the final point, and again, I think it just reemphasizes what Leland had to say, the WTO share of trade covered by import restrictions, 1.5 trillion in 2020, 0.75 trillion in 2017. So again, it doesn't make a difference. Absolutely. I think Leland and I agree on that. Is it the real source of the problem? I think Leland and I agree it's not the real source of the problem.
Thanks so much. So I just want to set up this question before I ask it. So we know that there are both supply and demand shocks driving inflation higher. On the demand side, you have labor markets at full employment. Workers are seeing wages rise. Some people still have some savings from past fiscal stimulus, and there's still also pretty powerful demand for housing. Meanwhile, on the supply side, you have shocks to food, energy, metals, and semiconductor chips, prices from the war, and also the constant risk of new supply chain disruptions as China is continuing what it's now calling a dynamic zero COVID policy. As I said yesterday, the Fed can do nothing to address the supply shocks. So are policymakers pushing on a string here? We'll start with Leland, and then we'll have John comment.
Well, I think, let me focus it on the China angle, because I spend my days working on China. And the dynamics out of China are both confusing and problematic. If you look at what's been happening over the last several months in China on the ground, you've actually seen quite significant domestic disinflation. And why was that? Because most of the economy, huge chunks of the economy, a lot of the big cities were under COVID zero lockdowns, which crushed demand. So everywhere else in the world seeing these huge inflation numbers, but if you stop an economy and you shut everybody in their homes, you're going to destroy demand, and that's going to be the dominant feature. So China domestically has seen disinflation in recent months. But what's confusing about all of this is that the picture, when everybody else is looking at China, they're scared to death of China exporting inflation. And this could come from two sources. So the most obvious source, and these are things that absolutely have to be and are on the Fed's radar, even though they can't do much about them. If you're shutting down your economy through these COVID zero lockdowns, you're clogging up your ports. You are shutting down the traffic arteries up and down your coast. You will have a serious supply shock on your hands. And the fear was always that the Chinese were going to export inflation into U.S. supply chains. So there was a lot of fear. It doesn't look like it's happening. At least it doesn't look like it's happening now or yet. But the fear was always that a supply-induced shock could cause a real problem for policymakers in the United States, because they would have this inflation coming over for China with no tools to do anything about it. But the reason this is even more complicated than I think people often give it credit for is that you could have the opposite problem coming out of China. We are not seeing big stimulus. I think a lot of these things are people reading too much into headlines. But if you do see a more significant bounce back in the Chinese economy the second half of the year, and it's not ridiculous to say that's possible, because it is a party Congress year, it's a political year. They are worried about not just low growth, but perceptions of low growth. So if you were to see some sort of stronger than expected bounce back the second half of the year, well, what are you doing then? You're fueling commodities inflation, you're fueling demand inflation, and so you could have the other side of the problem hit, and that would be another problem that policymakers would have to deal with coming from China, just from the opposite direction. So it's really confusing right now. The positive here, I don't want to be too negative. The positive is that based on our latest data, China Beige book data, they are threading the needle right now. And what I mean by that is the lockdowns have been easing up, and you haven't seen these incredible problems with inflation being exported into the West Coast of the United States, for instance. But the demand bounce back is much less impressive than advertised. So you have not seen the Chinese economy roar back to life like a lot of people were predicting. It's a very mild, tepid recovery at this point. So right now, it's actually great for the Fed. It's great for the world in terms of inflationary pressures, because they're sort of threading the needle between not causing supply side inflation, but also not causing demand side inflation. The problem with that is this could change in a dime. China's already in the process of going back into some baby lockdowns. There's a lot of fear right now. Shanghai could go back into another lockdown. We're seeing some of this on the ground. So you could see the scenario where the supply side becomes a problem again. And I guess theoretically, you also have to keep yourself open to the possibility that the bounce back after a few months of getting stimulus going could be much more powerful, starting in the fall. So this could change in a dime. Right now, they're threading the needle, but the problems coming out of China are significant and complex.
So I would say that in terms of pushing on a string, I think the Fed can get the job done. Now the surface is kind of sticky for them to be moving that string, but I think they can get the job done. My intellectual heritage, for some of you can probably tell, I mean, I had Robert Barrow, Bill Poole, and Herschel Grossman in graduate school. I mean, talk about a great combination of macroeconomist staff. And basically, I firmly believe that the Fed pursuing its current goals and raising interest rates does and will make a difference. Whether the political system will allow them, I think as Leland was hinting at, allow them to get back to 2% is another question. But I think it's key there. And one of the challenges, and again, that sticky service is tariffs and fiscal spending. But for those of you that are not aware of it, there's an economist named John Cochrane, and his argument picks up a little bit on what the former congressman said this morning, which is when you're issuing fiscal debt and running up deficits, if the public starts to believe that you are never really going to pay off that debt, or that like in Argentina and Venezuela and in Turkey, that you're going to allow inflation to pay off that debt, then you got a real problem. You can look in the Wall Street Journal, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, Professor Cochrane wrote an editorial about the whole thing. But if you want a copy of the editorial, just contact one of my co-conspirators here and we can move forward on that. But I think the Fed can get the job done. Yeah, I understand the supply side problems, but I think the Fed can get the job done if the political will is there, like under surprisingly Jimmy Carter, to allow the Fed to pursue its goals.
So John, you've referenced the Wall Street Journal a few times. Is there a Wall Street Journal rep here somewhere that,
No.
Well, John, on that point, can the Fed raise interest rates and achieve a soft landing? In other words, without inducing a recession?
No.
Great answer. Short and to the point. Thank
Short and
you.
to the point. I again, I know it's tough. I know my intellectual heritage, but it's like, okay, you got to get through this. Some of you know my references, Stockdale paradox. You're in a mess. You have to get through the mess. It's going to be ugly, but when you look on the other side, it's going to be okay. And if you ever know the story about Major Stockdale in the Vietnamese prison, it's a great story. But I think, I say, if the Biden administration is going to say, okay, give me a 1 year, 18-month recession, I can deal with it. We'll probably be out of it by the next presidential election, then go ahead and get it done. Because in the long run, as I think Leland was hinting at, if you start loosening that 2% and it becomes 3 or 4 or 5, and then you become Turkey, and then it's become a disaster. So you can't do that. Yeah, I mean, what credibility do you have? You tell me it's 2%, and then a year or two from now, it's 4 or 5. What am I supposed to believe? So anyway, thank you.
So Holly, do you think the Fed will blink if the economy slows too quickly or financial conditions tighten too drastically? Blinking meaning either slow the pace of hikes or just stop hiking or even cut interest rates. A lot of options there.
Sure. Well, for small business owners, I think they need certainty. They need certainty that what they believe the Fed is going to do, that they will do. So if it goes through difficult situations that they're going to have to navigate, I think most small business owners would say this is something that they will figure it out. They will adjust just like they've been adjusting over the last 2 years, business operations. But, if it looks like that it will get to the other side of calmer waters, they are willing to deal with it because the challenges that they face right now are immense. So I hope that they don't blink. I think small business owners hope that they don't blink. I hope that they feel that there is some trajectory that they will move forward with, and we'll get them to the other side, because right now it is, they are trying to operate in a very difficult situation.
Leland?
Yeah, couple hundred people here, a couple hundred different views on this subject. My personal view is that Fed governors, presidents, policymakers have personalities and they have egos. And the way that I sort of look at this is even outside the numbers. And what I see is back last fall, you don't want to be the Fed chair or the Fed, but particularly the Fed chair who guides his economy into, or her economy into, a recession. And so that was the dominating view. And how do we thread the needle here? When the inflation problem became recognized for what it was, which was something that was much more serious than most people were giving it credit for, I think the mindset of certain people in the Fed, probably the Fed chair, might have morphed and saying, I don't want to be Arthur Burns. I don't want to be remembered for being the Fed chair who's talked about decades from now as the one that let inflation go. So I don't know when this happened, but I suspect sometime last fall, people's mindsets and policymakers' mindsets may have changed. And that now I think that there's much more of a priority in making sure that we don't go down that path, and that inflation is taken much more seriously. And that if that takes an economic recession, a medium one or a bigger one, then so be it. But inflation has to be contained, not at all costs, but pretty close to it.
So we have two for the Fed will not. What's the third view, John?
I firmly believe that the Fed, I've got to believe that hopefully the Biden administration figures out the Fed actually 2 years for presidential. That's enough time. I know many of you know me over the last year because I argued that inflation is not transitory. There are a lot of signs that inflation is not transitory. Let's not go down that path. Made the argument that inflation was transitory, and it was not. And I think in this situation, inflation is not permanent. The Fed can get these inflation numbers down if they have the political support in the administration to get it down. And I agree entirely with Leland. For the Fed to blink, you can imagine the day after that, they will be saying Powell is another Arthur Burns. And I'm sure that Powell's reputation in terms of his intellectual capabilities, he does not want to be remembered as an Arthur Burns.
So I think we just saw and witnessed an historic event, 3 economists agreeing on something. So let's give that a round of applause. Okay, so this question I think is really apropos. So yes, there are many people who say that the Fed should not have a dual mandate, that the Fed should focus on price stability. But then there are just as many people who are saying, well, it's good the Fed has a dual mandate, and that its shift in language to full and inclusive employment was important, especially during the pandemic. So do you think the Fed has kind of abandoned that, or is it just kind of like you just kind of shift policy depending upon the times? Let's see, Leland, what are your thoughts on that one?
Well, I don't think the Fed has a dual mandate. I know what the legislation says. I don't think the Fed has it. I think the Fed more broadly sees its role as protector of the system. I think that because of what I see, and also in the past when China acted up years ago, there were a lot of panic on the inside the Fed about whether China could cause systemic problems that would sort of wash over the United States, and there was absolutely a willingness to factor that into the economic formula for how they handle the economy. So I think that they have been pressed into saying there's a dual mandate. But look, even if you agree that the only 2 things are price stability and jobs, you got to prioritize one over the other. And for a long, long time, no one took inflation seriously for good reason. And now people take inflation seriously. So I think there's a lot of mandates that the Fed has. The big one is not the dual mandate everyone thinks of, but to the extent that we look at it through the dual mandate lens, I would say that inflation is the new priority. Jobs are second until we get to a serious pain point, and this is just very different than the way that we've viewed things for many, many years.
So John, this speaks to financial stability as kind of the unofficial broad mandate of the Fed. What are your thoughts?
Okay, so this is a reference not to the Wall Street Journal. Okay. For those of you who have studied a little bit in decision making, there's a famous story about a United Airlines flight 173. And the story is that the pilot was so focused on trying to get the landing gear down, he totally forgot that they ran out of gasoline and they crashed in Oregon and a whole bunch of people died. From my personal point of view, I think the Fed stayed way too early, too long, but you know that in terms of transitory inflation. And what happened is they geared way too much towards lowering the unemployment rate with, again, all due respect, the full unemployment rate is pretty well undefined. And they allowed inflation to get out of control. And now they've got to gear that sailboat on the other side to try to get the inflation numbers under control. I think the Fed does have a dual mandate. I support that dual mandate. Some of you know, I worked at the Senate Banking Committee and I wrote the new legislation backing up that dual mandate. And I think you got to keep both, you got to keep your eyes on both items. You can't do this, you have to have situational awareness. I'll put it that way. You can't just focus on one thing and then all of a sudden figure out I got to switch and focus on the other thing. That's not good. It's not good for the economy. So for me, I think the Fed should have a dual mandate. I quite obviously think that they sort of lost that sight at the second half of last year. They're regaining that sight on inflation this year. We have to go through a difficult transition period, but I do support the dual mandate.
Thank you. So Holly, let's switch gears a little bit. Labor markets. Labor shortages are everywhere, especially in in-person services. And the number one thing that businesses are doing are raising wages and bidding up benefits and that sort of thing, and also introducing or allowing remote work, et cetera. But I've also heard many people say that a recession would solve the labor shortages problems. It's kind of a bad way to solve, a bad problem. Do you think firms will just simply take down help wanted ads, or will they significantly cut payrolls?
Sure. So very few employers will cut payroll. They will just not increase those new positions, those starting wages. They will the starting wages will be lower or, kind of remain the same without increasing. But, so right now, a third of our members are saying that inflation is our single most important problem in operating their business. A quarter of them are saying that labor quality is their single most important problem operating their business. Interestingly, for compensation, which is their main tool, obviously, for recruiting and retaining workers, and most of it is in wages. So it is very expensive in a long-term financial commitment for a small business owner to offer benefits and most importantly, health insurance is the most costly of them. But just to put this in perspective of kind of where a small business owner is the lens of which they're looking through. In 2019, the net percent of business owners, employers saying that they are planning to increase compensation 21%. Those who actually increased compensation over the last 6 months in 2019 was 28%. Right now, 28% are planning to raise compensation and 48% are doing it. So the ability to plan as a small business owner to absorb those costs, to compete, to fill those positions is incredibly challenging right now when they're struggling to kind of navigate all this. Planning just went absolutely out the window for a lot of them. When, for small business owners, we're seeing that this last survey, about 8 percentage points lower in those looking to hire, the net percent looking to increase their workforce. However, still 50% of them have an open position that they're willing to fill. And that's 1 point shy of the 48-year record high level for the question. So it is kind of an interesting situation where many of them are kind of slowing up or not pursuing the kind of going out there to hire, but they do have these open positions that many of them are having to either fill through overtime with their current staff, or the owner often is the one contributing to absorbing some of these responsibilities of the positions that they aren't able to hire. But it is the one cost, and I wanted to put this out, that it is the one cost that they can control. Prices, they are very difficult to control for a small business owners. They have little leeway as far as navigating different suppliers that might have better terms for them, but compensation and wages are what they can control, and hiring that next employee.
Thanks, Holly. So given this fact that businesses are raising wages in response to quitting and labor shortages, John, are we on the cusp of a wage price spiral?
Well, the challenge for me, again, you all know I'm an econometrician, is that causality runs both ways between your CPI number that you got yesterday and the employee cost per unit of gross value added. It all sounds very fancy. And if you need the graph, contact somebody at Trout Ranch Gulch and they'll give you the graph. But the causality runs both ways. And so one feeds upon another. I think it was a great lesson. And if I may quote Milton Friedman's speech, where once inflation gets in there, the labor market tends to say, hey, the inflation numbers increased. I need to increase my compensation. And then that raises unit labor costs or employee costs per gross value added. And it does have a wage price spiral. So once again, I will say, yeah, it's a real challenge. And to the extent that the Fed gets ahead of this thing, I think is really key. And I would just summarize, if you watch, there are two really good Fed indicators that I think are great. I always mentioned the price pressures measure from the St. Louis Fed. It's the probability that the inflation in the next 12 months will exceed 2.5%. My bet is that sometimes somebody at the Fed is going to look at that number and figure out that the probability is less than 50%, and the Fed's going to figure out victory. And the other thing I would watch is the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta publishes a sticky price index. When that number starts coming down, then you know you're victorious. It's not going to be all these volatile numbers at one end of the tail or the other. It's going to be those sticky prices. And I would watch those two numbers, and that would dictate to me that we were actually beating the wage price spiral.
Thanks, John. The last couple of questions, and do we have Q&A? Is there Q&A? Yes, there is. All right, so I'll just ask one of these questions so we have some Q&A. So the U.S. is engaging in industrial policies, particularly in response to the perceived challenge of China along many fronts: trade, influence, military might, etc. Can the U.S. really decouple from China? So I'll ask Holly first, and then I'll give Leland the last words. That's his bread and butter.
I should probably just hand this over to Leland. For talking with small business owners, it is a mixed bag on how they feel about this. They are very dependent on inventory and supplies that come from China, but they also are very strong in their belief that they would like more, U.S. Control over some of these supplies and inventories that they need to operate their business. So small business owners, it's a tricky situation for them in kind of navigating this. And with that, I will hand it over to Leland.
Yeah, so a lot of this is definitional. If the question is, am I worried that we're going to move deeper into decoupling? The answer is no. I think we should do some decoupling. I think we are doing some decoupling. If you look at what's happening on the tech side, no, I don't think the Pentagon should be using Huawei or Hikvision. No, I don't think that there should be an interwoven tech tapestry. I don't think that we should be giving the Chinese advanced semiconductors. So on the tech side, I think decoupling is pretty sound policy. But the problem here is that decoupling means a lot of things, and it's not a monolithic word, nor is deglobalization. So if we're talking about decoupling, the idea of truly decoupling, whether it's the US and China or China and the West, no, that's not going to happen. No, it's not easy to see how that would happen outside of an all-out war. Nor do I think it would be good for the world, for the United States, for China, for anyone else. So to be very careful when we use the term decoupling, because it's used by various people in economics and in policy for very different reasons. I think that the best way to approach it would be to see it instead of being something monolithic, say for supply chains. We're not ripping all supply chains out of China. They'll still be intermixed in this. You take tech out, sure. Do you take out some other things like PPE or pharmaceutical ingredients? Well, that's a call for policymakers. They have to decide where along the line this becomes a national security interest that supersedes the economic interest. And if the answer is it supersedes, then yes, decouple. And if it doesn't, then don't decouple. So I think we have to be very careful about using the decoupling term, because in the grander sense, decoupling is not happening, and it won't happen. In the individual sector by sector sense, in certain supply chains, it absolutely is. It absolutely should. So this sort of allows me, I love this question because it allows me to answer yes or no, depending on what everyone else is saying. I just go the opposite direction.
Excellent. Thanks so much to our panel. At this time, we're going to open it up for Q&A from our participants.
Thanks very much. Great panel. We talked a lot about monetary policy, and we all agree it should tighten. But what about fiscal policy? Should it reinforce the Fed by tightening? Should it work against the Fed by easing? Should it pursue supply side reforms and not care a whole lot about what's going on in the labor market? For any and all of the panelists, thanks.
Who'd like to take that one? John's writing
Well,
furiously.
well, okay. As I started my presentation, unfortunately, I do live in a world where we have an entertainment wing for economists. And as those of you who read my newsletter and monthly update know darn well, I never comment on fiscal policy. But given you're a longtime friend, what I would say is, yeah, I would support some tax reform changes. I would try to take some of the tax laws that are in place and make them permanent. I think that's key. And then I agree with Congressman Ryan, to try to reform some of the entitlements is just absolutely key. Those are simple answers, but the details I'll leave to the true experts in fiscal policy.
Can I make a connected point real quick? Just again, big picture. One of the main problems we have as a society is the fact that monetary policy was turned on. You could say it was a bad idea, you could say it was a good idea, but for years and years, it inflated asset prices and it made the rich get richer. And so in the mindset of a lot of people across much of the political spectrum, fiscal policy was going to be this grand equalizer, where people who did not benefit from the monetary policy stimulus of the past decade were able to get benefits on the fiscal side. And we ran into a wall, and that's not going to be possible. I don't think very few people think it'll be possible to do any type of equalizing movement in a world of high inflation. So here's the problem. That's going to be stressful. That's going to be stressful for society. That's something that can create massive divisions. And it's already creating massive divisions in our political society. So I don't know there's any answer to that, but it does mean that this is the headache that we're going to have going forward. We cannot rectify what's going to happen. We can't rectify the monetary policy mistakes via fiscal policy, and that's going to leave a lot of people going forward very upset at the system.
And I would agree with Leland. GIC was very kind to me. Several years ago, I had an opportunity to present a paper with a couple of my colleagues at the GIC meeting at the Banque de France. And we made the argument that a very expansionary monetary policy actually increases income inequality. And I think for many of you, you can probably appreciate the fact that prior to 2020, those last 3 or 4 years, the people who had houses and had invested wealth gained very much, but the inflation numbers exceeded the wage gains. And that's certainly still true now. And so that middle income, lower middle income population really got hit. And again, going back, just looking at the data, if you look at real household income for the last year, disposable income, personal income, it's negative for the last year. So that part of the population is really getting hit. So it's, I always thank GIC for letting me, and that paper was subsequently published in the IMF papers. So it was actually taken somewhat serious.
And then on the small business side, obviously taxes, federal, state, and local are huge considerations for allowing small businesses to better operate and navigate these, inflation pressures and all the things that they have to deal with. So as Congressman Ryan talked about, making some of these tax provisions that were passed in 2017 permanent for specifically the small business sector, including that 20% small business deduction on qualifying business income, would go a long way to support the small business sector in that front.
Thanks. Dana, I want to say fantastic job moderating. And what I wanted to do is throw the 4-letter questions back to you, specifically anything you want to emphasize or anything you see differently, and maybe share the conference board's perspective.
Sure.
Do you
So
need to be reminded of the 4-letter words?
recession, inflation. Yeah. So, the conference board's official view is that, yes, we will enter into a recession. We don't think we're necessarily in a recession right now. Sorry, John. But certainly, it could happen in the third quarter, most likely in the fourth quarter, first quarter, but very weak growth flanked by stagflationary, in a stagflationary environment with very high inflation, very low growth. That's our view. Our view is that inflation is probably going to remain high. It's going to be very difficult to get it back down to the 2% target. We may not get to the 2% target until sometime in 2024. And even still, I think there's going to be this ongoing struggle because you have these existential forces that are going to keep inflation elevated. We just finished talking about wages. We're going to have labor shortages, we think, forever. Unless there are major changes in policy and also incentives. And so given that, you're going to have these wage pressures that are essentially going to weigh on businesses. They're going to pass that on to the customer. Deglobalization, I'm using it in a broad term, Leland. So, but certainly that's something that's happening where, for security reasons, for a lot of reasons, governments, not just the US, but around the world, are looking at reshoring or friendshoring, or essentially reorienting the global system of supply chains that have kept prices at bay for imports. So I think, we've entered a new regime where you're going to have low growth and probably inflation that's higher than what many central banks, including the Fed, are comfortable with.
This has been fantastic. I'd like to share some very current information. I know economists, and I'm a University of Chicago supply side, money supply side economist type, but traveling the US building warehouses for Amazon and the like, we have a supply side problem. Demand is outstripping supply by unfathomable degrees. The LA Long Beach market, last 5 quarters, rent went up 105% for the last 5 quarters. Demand is outstripping supply. We can't build warehouses fast enough for all kinds of reasons today. Disruption in labor, disruption in material supply, disruptions at the port. And by the way, if you think that inflation can be controlled by interest rates, the longshoreman contract expired last Tuesday. Go back to 2014 when they went on strike the last time. And if this administration doesn't force the longshoremen to go back to work, inflation will not be under control by raising interest rates in the short term. So it's going to have a big impact. But the logistics market, the growth, labor is the key factor. And what's going to impact labor? The last 12 months, the manufacturing industry spent almost $100 billion on new construction in the US. Onshoring is growing dramatically with manufacturers. I was just in Phoenix yesterday, and there's 50 or 60 manufacturers building new buildings there from the onshoring perspective. The indices that we read is that about 80% of the Fortune 1000 are all onshoring. They're manufacturing in some way, shape, or form. So I think you're going to see tremendous pressure on labor and impacted by this growth of manufacturing in the US. So I think that's going to be hard to maintain that control over that as well. From a decoupling perspective, we need China. We can't decouple. We've also seen a tremendous growth in Chinese companies opening up business here in the US. I don't know what the small business indices say, but we're seeing them all over the major supply markets. Tremendous growth in these small Chinese companies opening up distribution and manufacturing here, anticipating something or some changes, but it appears that. But anyway, I think I think inflation is going to continue. I'm not sure that we can raise interest rates fast enough to offset some of the growth that we see on the ground today.
So let me make one comment on your supply side commentary, and I'll refer to something Governor Waller mentioned earlier. There's a great chart. It's called a spider chart, published by the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. And if you want to see or estimate that the labor problem is being solved, look at the employment population ratio. The employment population ratio in May is below what it was in 2020. So in other words, we got not enough people as a percentage of this population working. So I think if you watch that spider chart over the next 3, 6, 9 months, you may see the improvement in the labor market. So that would be, again, it's publicly available information. It's easy to monitor, and it should just comes out every month. And so it's a great piece of information. Otherwise, as Governor Waller mentioned, the rest of that spider chart is all around top notch. I mean, you're at the max of everything else except for that one indicator, the employment population ratio. So I would watch that to see if are we solving the labor problem.
I mean, I would also toss in the labor force participation rate. It's well below what it was before the pandemic. And it's our view at the Conference Board that it's not going to get back to where it was. First of all, you have thousands of people retiring early, and they're not coming back. I mean, how hard is it to actually retire? Would you want to undo that and try to do that again? But you also have a lot of folks who, have serious issues around childcare. There are 115,000 missing childcare workers, right? So if you're a parent and you want to work, it's hard to do that if there's no one watching your children. This is especially acute for families with school-age children. So I guess I'm a little less optimistic. I think we're still going to have shortages of labor simply because we have an aging population, more people retiring, and unless there are major policy changes, I don't really see a reversal in that. I think we might have time for one more question, and then we're out of time after that. Sure. All right, thanks so much, everybody.